Hi, today we're going to take a look at the new Samyang 75mm f1.8 lens for Sony E-mount cameras. So let's see what it can do. Several months ago we got the Samyang AF 75mm f1.8 lens for review. This lens is part of Samyang's growing family of AF lenses, and more specifically the small, light and affordable line which they refer to as tiny but almighty. The AF 75mm f1.8 is a focal length which used to be popular back in the film days before 85mm became more common. It is also worth mentioning that last year we looked at another member of this line, the AF 45mm f1.8, which performed quite well. As we typically do, we shall start with design and build before we move over to performance and give you our final verdict. The lens has 10 elements in 9 groups with quite a number of advanced elements for its size, including 2 HR and 3 ED elements, as well as an ultra multi-layer coating. The lens is made from a hard plastic material with its internals made out of metal and glass, of course, just like the rest of this family of lenses. As with all of the lenses in this line, the 75mm f1.8 is very lightweight and compact, measuring just about 8 cm or 3 inches tall and weighing in at just over 270 grams, including the hood and caps, which is really super lightweight. The lens has a single multi-purpose ring with no hard stops. It has a decent resistance and is not too narrow. Talking about the multi-purpose ring, this lens has a new and interesting custom switch that has 2 modes. In mode 1 you get a common manual focusing or manual override of autofocus depending on your camera settings, while in mode 2 the ring will give smooth aperture control without click steps. This was a little bit confusing at first, but it seemed to work fine. We would actually love it if it had a 3-mode switch, with a third forcing the lens into manual focus like some Sony lenses do. Samyang promised that this switch will get an update in the future with more custom settings via firmware. So far at least, this did not happen. The lens has no weather sealing, so be mindful of using it in the rain. The lens comes only in Sony E-mount. We tested it on our A7R IV and our A6500. The lens comes with a nice and fairly deep plastic hood. As for the aperture, the 75mm f1.8 has 9 aperture blades with a fairly large front element compared to its size. The lens also has a pretty small filter thread of 58mm. Now let's move over to performance, and we'll start with autofocus. Stills and video autofocus is courtesy of a linear stepping motor system. It is fairly quick, and although not as accurate as Sony native glass, it is certainly significantly improved compared to what Samyang had to offer just a few years ago. Moving over to sharpness, we tested the sharpness of the lens using our special large professional Imatest high-resolution chart. In the center of the frame, wide open, the lens isn't super sharp. Closing down to f2.8 shows some improvement, but only at f4 you really see significant jump with a little extra boost at f5.6. The corners showed a similar behavior, but with a significant boost in sharpness coming only at f5.6. Interestingly, this was not the same on both corners. One was much sharper than the other, so much so that we had to ask for a second copy of the lens, and there was a clear difference between the two in terms of sharpness, which is of course not unheard of in the optical industry. With that in mind, we were really surprised to see how this lens compared to our more expensive native Sony 85mm f1.8 lens. Both the center and corners of the Samyang seem to be sharper at f1.8 and at f2.8, showing a lot more details across the frame. Pretty impressive. The official close-up distance of this lens is 69 cm from the sensor plane. In our testing, we were able to focus at around 65 cm from the sensor. Image quality wide open was decent, but it did improve noticeably when we closed down to f2.8. The lens has some very visible breathing, as you can see in the video, so keep this in mind if you consider this lens for video shooting. Chromatic aberration seems to be fairly well controlled on this lens, even wide open, with a visible improvement at f2.8. Flare can be quite noticeable straight in from the lens. Use the hood and try to avoid direct light unless you are seeking that specific flare look. The lens has a very significant darkening of the corners wide open. This effect improves at f2.8 and significantly goes down at f4, but it doesn't disappear completely even at f5.6. To be fair, our Sony 85mm f1.8 also has about the same amount of vignetting, so this isn't unique to this lens. The lens might have a very slight pincushion distortion, but it is honestly quite minimal. At the very center of the frame, light balls are nice and round, turning oval as you move away from the center. The light balls themselves are very clean without any visible onion rings. The Samyang AF 75mm f1.8 lens is a very interesting offer by the company. It is small and lightweight, but the real surprise to us was the optical performance. In our test, it performed visibly better than the more expensive Sony 85mm f1.8, and although certainly not a perfect lens, it proved to be very capable. As with almost any other product, there are also downsides. Although the build quality is okay, it still feels a bit plasticky, and the switch on the side of the lens that allows the user to change the aperture feels more like a gimmick than a useful feature. A simple AF/MF would have been much more useful in our opinion. Vignetting on this lens is very prominent up to f4, plus some might miss the weather sealing of the Sony lens. At the end of the day, compared to the $600 that the Sony 85mm f1.8 is currently selling for, $400 Samyang 75mm f1.8 seems like a pretty sweet deal for a compact, inexpensive and fast full-frame portrait lens. So that was our look at the Samyang 75mm f1.8 lens for Sony E-mount cameras. You can check out the full review with all 5 test results on lensvid.com. Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel where you can find a lot more videos just like this. See you next time.